I think part of it is we have this stereotype that men are self-important, arrogant people, and really they kind of are. But it turns out being self-important and arrogant, you don't use I words much. In fact, we all use I words when we're kind of anxious, self-reflective. When we're looking inward, we're being honest. Just the opposite of what we think I words are.
Welcome to the Lucas Skrobot Show, where we uncover purpose, relentlessly pursue truth, and own the future. I'm your host, Lucas Skrobot, and today we are joined by Dr. James Pennebaker. Dr. Pennebaker is the Regents Centennial Professor of Liberal Arts and Professor of Psychology. He and his students are exploring natural language use, group dynamics, and personality in both the laboratory and the real world settings. His earlier work on expressive writing found that physical health and work performance can improve by simple writing and or talking exercises. His cross-disciplinary research is related to linguistics, clinical and cognitive psychology, communication, medicine, and computer science. Author and editor of 12 books and over 300 articles, Dr. Pennebaker has received numerous research and teaching awards and honors. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 1977, and some of his notable books are The Secret Life of Pronouns, which we're going to be talking about, and Opening Up by Writing It Down. Dr. Pennebaker, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
It's good to be here.
Now, I've been reading your book. I've been going through your material, and I wanted to start with a question. How did you, as a social psychologist, decide to dive deep into researching, people's words and diving through massive amounts of text and articles? It seems like a quite of a boring idea on the onset of it. What was that original story that got you into researching language?
Well, I should tell you, if someone had come to me in high school and said, Jamie, in 40 years from now, you're going to be studying articles and prepositions and auxiliary verbs, I'd go, oh no, what happened? Where did I go wrong? That was not the direction I was planning. I was fascinated by psychology. I've always been interested in what makes us tick. Why do we do what we do? And I got into it, and early on I became a little bit appalled that so much of social psychology was based on questionnaires. We didn't look at what people were actually doing. We just asked them what they thought they were doing.
Which is a horrible way to get information out of people.
It is. It's based on the theories we have about ourselves. I think I'm a really warm, compassionate person, even though I might kick my dog and be horrible to my wife and kids or whatever. What's important to me was real world behavior, and measuring it was always difficult. So I actually had ended up studying how people cope with traumatic experiences, and I discovered that people who have major traumas in their lives could be almost anything, we know is associated with their getting sick. So physical health is a marker of dealing with upheavals, but I discovered that people who had major upheavals that they kept secret had far more health problems. In other words, keeping big secrets is really unhealthy for you. And what I discovered later was that if I brought those people in the laboratory and had them write about these big secrets, their health improved. And this is what this expressive writing idea was. And I ended up doing a number of studies, and I kept wondering, why is it writing or talking about something upsetting is good for your health? And I had published my first papers on this, and other labs were interested. And the question now was, well, why is this true? And the answer turns out to be, depends on different factors. That could be another episode. But it occurred to me, maybe the secret was looking at the way they were writing. Maybe it was the topics they were writing or whatever. And so I had a bunch of clinical psychology graduate students read these essays, and people were writing about the most traumatic experiences of their lives, and there were lots of essays. And I asked the students to rate these, to what degree is it coming to terms with it? Do they seem to understand themselves, etc.? And what I found was that it took forever for the students to do it. Reading these really horrible, sad stories depressed the students, so they were almost worthless because they were so burned out by it. And they didn't agree on the dimensions at all. And so I thought, well, I'll just get a computer program to analyze what they're writing about. And this was in the
seems simple enough, right?
Yeah. And so I went to a bookstore to buy a computer program that analyzed language, and they looked at me and say, "We don't have anything like that." And so I started calling around, and there didn't seem to be one. And then I started calling some linguists, and they didn't. They all thought it was a good idea. Then I called computer scientists, and they couldn't help me. So I thought, well, hell, I took Fortran in college. How hard can it be? So fortunately, I had a graduate student, Martha Francis, whose background had been in computer science. And I had a good idea how I thought the computer program would work. And I said, Martha, this will just take, probably 2-3 weeks at the most. And it turned out it took a lot longer than that. But what we came up with was this computer program called LIWC, LIWC, which stands for Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. And with it, we were able to go in and analyze how people were writing. And we did, in fact, find some fingerprints of who benefited and who didn't. And what was interesting was it wasn't the content of what people were writing that was important. It was the way they were writing. And then all of a sudden, I hear we had this program. And I started, this was just about the time that the internet was coming online. And every night I'd start downloading data that was coming. So if you're above a certain age, you've heard of America Online, but AOL had these things called chat groups. Unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
People from all over the world would be on these chat groups. And there were chat groups for fishing, for sports, for dating, for everything. And I just start downloading them each night. And then I'd start analyzing them and see if I can see differences between men and women, between this group and that group. And I started seeing some things that made no sense. So for example, the first thing was differences between men and women. And I thought, well, everybody knows, you could guess what the differences would be. Men would use I words more, I thought. Women would use emotion words more. Women would definitely use we words more. Men would be more logical and use cognitive words and so forth. Anyway, everything I believed, and what most people even today believe.
Right. Those are all things. If I were to think, okay, how do men talk versus how do women talk? Those are going to be the stereotypical things that run through my mind.
And everybody believes that. And it's all wrong. It turns out women use I words at much higher rates than men. And, I did that first analysis and I thought, well, and this is science. Well, there you go. There's a fluky difference. I'm sure that if I do it again with a different group, it won't hold up. Then I did it with another group, and it came out the same way. Women use I words more than men did. Well, you can have two weird studies in a row. Then I did a third study, and it came out. And I started to read, why is this? Well, I think part of it is we have this stereotype that men are self-important, arrogant people, and really they kind of are. But it turns out being self-important and arrogant, you don't use I words much. In fact, we all use I words when we're kind of anxious, self-reflective. When we're looking inward, we're being honest. Just the opposite of what we think I words are. In any case, I started finding differences with prepositions and auxiliary verbs and these junk words that nobody cares about, and it just fascinated me. So it wasn't that I was interested in language, and quite frankly, I'm still not very interested in language. But as a tool to understand people, it turned out to be an unbelievably rich source of information.
Wow.
That's a very long answer.
Well, you talk about in your book, you talk about these differences, and you mentioned here how you started examining people's articles. If I was going about this, and it sounds like when you started off, you're doing this as well. I would be looking at people's descriptive words. Kind of like even in how they portray the Unabomber, how they broke that case. They're looking at specific phrases that someone might use that might uniquely point to the identity of who they are. So I would stereotypically think, okay, women are going to probably be using softer, more descriptive language. Men are going to be talking more about things and in more analytic ways. But instead of going towards the nouns, the descriptive words, you said, no, I'm going to focus on the articles. And in your book, you describe how even nouns, the way we process that happens in a different part of our brain than we would do articles. And maybe even for those who have forgotten all of their English grammar, what are the differences between nouns and articles, pronouns? Like how are you separating those? And then where and why do we process those in different areas of our brain?
So there's a million ways you can slice and dice language. And, I still have PTSD from high school English, trying to figure out the different parts of speech and wondering why in the world did I ever have to learn this stuff. Another way to slice and dice it is there are kind of very broadly two types of words. There are words that convey content, and then there are words that seem to be just kind of those filler words that help to make language flow more smoothly. So, for example, I am holding a pen. So there are two content words there, holding and pen. And the other words are I'm and that's it. So in that situation, we have two content words and two or three junk words. We don't call them junk words. These junk words are really called function words, and they serve different. So I am a pen. So I am and the word a. Those words are all very brief, and in virtually all languages, they have words like this. We have a vocabulary of almost 100,000 words. And of those 100,000 words, almost all of them are nouns, regular verbs, and adjectives, and most adverbs. In other words, are really rich in content. However, these little junk words, they are pronouns like I, me, you, he, it, prepositions to, of, for, articles a, n, and the, and a few others. These junk words, these function words, in English, it's only about maybe 200 common ones. Whereas the rest of our vocabulary, the other 99,900 or 800 words, are content words, which means that these content words, each one we use very, very rarely, whereas we have to use these same function words over and over and over again. And you can think of them as building blocks. And because they're so common, they're really easy for me to analyze. So to give you an example, in our brief discussion so far, I haven't been but probably 65% of all the words I've used have been function words. And as I ask you, have I used a high rate of articles? How about prepositions? How about pronouns? You've got no idea. I've got no idea.
No idea.
And one reason you can't do it is because they're processed really differently. As we are speaking, as we're listening, we are listening. What is the content of the speech here? And if I say, I am holding the pen or a pen, you won't notice the difference, but the difference is slight. and it changes the meaning. So if I said I'm holding the pen, your brain would assume that you already know about the pen, because if I say the pen, I'm referring to a specific pen. But the point with all of this is we process these function words very, very quickly, and they're processed in one area of the brain, and the content words are processed in another part of the brain. And so our conscious awareness of the content words, we have more access to that, whereas we don't have access to these function words.
And where are these function words processed? What part of the brain and what other functions happen in that same part of the brain?
So this turns out to be a more complicated question than I would have liked. But we know from brain damage studies that different parts of the brain seem to be relevant. So if you look at the brain, so most people, their brain functions, their language functions are on the left side of the brain. Not everybody, but most. And different functions that go in the frontal area, which is the frontal and the temporal lobe, and right there in the middle is a more heavy language area, which is referred to as Wernicke's area, and the more frontal area is Broca's area. And what's interesting is Broca's area is related to not only function word processing, but also often emotional issues, nonverbal issues. Whereas Wernicke's area, which is right smack in the middle of the temporal area, is related to hardcore language processing. So, for example, if there's damage to Wernicke's area, and I'm asked to describe what's in front of me, I would probably say, well, it's this is right here, and right there is that part, and then behind there's the little deal there. I'd be using words that are essentially almost all function words. Whereas if I had damage to Broca's area, and just now the content, and I'm asked the same question, I'd say computer, black computer, sitting, screen, and the words would almost be all content words. But I'd also not have any social skills. I'd be speaking in a slow, painful, descriptive way. Whereas with damage to my Wernicke's area, my Broca's area is working just fine. And I look you in the eye, I speak to you in a really, a warm social kind of way. In other words, my social skills are intact, but my ability to convey hard information is not.
Well, when I read that in your book, I was so fascinated because it's not just something that's unique to the English language, but you've done these studies in Arabic and other languages as well. And you point out the fact that in that Broca's area, that is more unaccessible to us. And so when we're learning a language at an older age, it is difficult to acquire that language, not because we can't memorize a bunch of descriptive words or subject words, but because it's hard to put those articles into Broca's area and know how to put it all together, where all the screws go into the sentence. And I have found that to be true, that I can know a bunch of vocabulary, and I do, but oftentimes putting together with the right conjunctions, with the right pronouns and all that to put it together into something that's, fluent, that is very difficult for me as not a native Arabic speaker. And so when I heard that made so much sense. And then in your book, you go on to say how that the language that comes out of the Broca's area is almost like this subconscious language that we can't really control. It just kind of happens. It comes out and it almost exposes what's actually going inside our heads, our hearts. And it's almost like a litmus test that it's something that we can't control as much, whereas we can control whether we're, really being intentional to not use harsh, angry language or depressed language. That I found really fascinating.
Me too. And I found it almost magical. And one good example of this is when people lie versus telling the truth. Is we don't sit down before we're about to tell a lie and say, okay, I'm going to use this kind of language. We just start talking. And one thing that we often do when we are caught in a situation where we have to be deceptive, it could be interpersonal or whatever. What we do is we psychologically put what we're saying away from us, which means we often don't use the word I. So if I'm asked, where were you yesterday afternoon at 2:00? And yesterday at 2:00, I was at I was at a bar getting drunk, and my employer better not know or whatever. And I'll say, oh, yesterday afternoon at 2:00. Yeah, that was a time. The library was closed, and I would use words where I would try not to use I would probably use we, or just try to push it away. Whereas if I'm telling the truth, I'd say, well, yesterday I went to the library and I thought that I'd be able to get a book, but it turns out the library was closed. So instead I did this. And what happens when I'm telling the truth, I'll use a lot more I words, and I'll also use some words that are called, they're kind of differentiators. They're words like except, but, without, where you're saying not only what you did do, but what you didn't do. I did this, but then this happened. And that's too complex when you are lying. And there are all these other things our brain just does, kind of out of our control, so that we are kind of almost psychologically protecting ourselves. So we're in a weird way not lying to ourselves as much, but we don't have any awareness that we're doing it.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting about the lying as well. How when people are lying, they're telling you what you did do, but they have a very difficult time to tell you what they didn't not do. And it's a very interesting point that when, even in political situations, or, when we're sharing our ideas and our beliefs, oftentimes we're modifying, using modifiers to really help people understand where we sit on a specific position. So rather than just giving a blanket statement of, oh, I think this is, the answer for whatever, political, social situation, it's, I think this is the answer, but there's these other complicated things, and we have to look at it at a higher resolution. And so that I also found was really interesting as a telling, kind of a tell of when you're listening to someone, or someone describe what they believe, or a politician saying what they're going to do, to even be able to be conscious. But I guess, are we able to be conscious to pick that up, or is that too complex that we actually need to, use computers to analyze someone's language to pick out what they're using?
I think people are notoriously bad at detecting deception. So in studies that there have been, hundreds, thousands of studies on deception over the years. And if a person is talking to somebody and they don't know that they might be being deceived, we typically believe they're telling the truth. And if we're told, we're given a bunch of videotapes and we're saying, okay, some of these people are telling the truth, some are lying. What you find is that the average person will be able to identify the liars maybe 57% of the time, where 50% is chance. And if they're just looking at the written script, they don't do as well. It's like 53% versus 50%. And if you are a real expert, and you're looking at these nonverbals at the videotape, you might get up to 60% accuracy. In other words, humans are really bad at it. And a computer does better. It doesn't do great. In our studies, we can do usually 67%, sometimes as high as 72% is the highest I've ever gotten. And anybody who says they can do better than that, I would question.
They're liars.
They're a liar. Exactly. but it's very, very hard to do. And a computer makes it does make it easier.
Now, you also write about in your book, and you've mentioned in here, even starting with the description of how men and women use pronouns, using I and we more, and Obama has been accused of using I a lot in his speeches. When he gives a State of the Union, the headline afterwards is Obama used I, X amount of times in the State of the Union. And then the same goes with Trump. They normally say, well, Trump uses we, X amount of times in the State of the Union versus I. And at least from what I've read on the news is that there's vast differences between the amount of use of I in Obama's language versus the amount of use of we in Trump's language. What are the reasons for that? Is that true? Since you go through and you've scraped the internet and actually analyzed all that language, and what does that point to in a person's personality, what they're thinking, how they're associating themselves with the group?
So I words are, to me, the most interesting. And one reason is in spoken language, the word I is the most common word used in English by quite a bit. And we are horrible at knowing if somebody uses I at high rates. So keep in mind that I is associated with confidence. Or lack of confidence. So if you're insecure, if you are not sure of what you're talking about, you would use I at high rates, just the opposite of what we think. And if you're confident, even arrogant, you use I words at very low rates. Obama, of all U.S. presidents, used I words the least. I mean, he used I words hardly at all. Nevertheless, whenever he gave a talk, he would use I words maybe 3 or 4 times, which is essentially never. And the right-wing media the next day would I remember reading, an article by Peggy Noonan. I can't believe that self-centered guy. He used I more than I've ever heard. He used it 3 or 4 times. But when he said it, it was kind of like a slap across the face, because it was so out of the ordinary for him. Whereas George Bush used I all the time. So Trump's use of language is fascinating. He uses I at very high rate, and in fact, which reflects the fact that I think he's actually quite insecure. Even though he speaks with bluster, you can tell that when somebody attacks him, he just can't let it go. But there's another feature to language that is interesting, and this is we have this dimension in language that we call analytic thinking in a kind of normal, logical way. Mm. And when Trump ran in 2016, we were doing a lot of analyses of him versus the other Republicans he was running against. And this analytic measure takes into account both pronouns but also prepositions and articles. And we do a very good job at identifying how logical and formal a person's thinking is through their use of this language. And not surprisingly, Trump's came out quite low. He was by far the lowest of everybody that was running, and much, much lower than Hillary. And one of my students did this analysis, and she says, this is unbelievable. And because it's also sometimes linked to intelligence, suggesting low intelligence. And so I said, well, let's look at how previous presidents have done. So she went and looked at 5 or 6 presidents. She came back. She said, there must be some mistake because Obama's is about the same level as Trump's. And
that is fascinating.
It's really fascinating because she then goes and analyzes speech, starting off with inaugural addresses, then States of the Union addresses, and then presidential papers and everything, going back to George Washington. And what we found was if you look at George Washington in terms of how analytic he was, in the early people, they were very analytic in terms of their numbers. And the numbers were pretty much flat until we get to about Teddy Roosevelt, and then it started dropping in a linear fashion, so that it's true, Trump is the lowest ever. The next lowest is Obama, and the ones below and just above that were Bush, Reagan, Clinton, and so forth. And what's happened in the U.S., and she also found this for leaders of Great Britain, Canada, and Australia, is that with the growth of the media and with the change in who votes, presidents, the people who win, are speaking in simpler and simpler ways. And if you look at Obama, and those who have read his work, there's no question he's incredibly smart. But the way he talks and writes is very simple. That the candidates who are able to speak in a simple way are the ones who tend to win, and the ones who speak with confidence often are the winners as well. So we're seeing these fascinating cultural shifts that have been going on for a long time. So it's partly personality that the language is capturing, but it's also the way that these people are pandering to us, the voters. And we, the voters, are looking for people who speak simply and with great confidence, even if they have no knowledge of what they're talking about. If it's simple and confident, we're suckers. We are voting for the Cheetos of politicians.
That's fascinating.
Not to be harsh about Cheetos.
Well, I after thinking about this, I went today and I went to your website and I pulled up Barack Obama's Twitter feed, and I pulled up President Trump's Twitter feed as well, and I analyzed them. And you're right along that. If you look at their analytical thinking styles, Trump is at 60 and Obama is at 71 over the last however many tweets that was pulled. But what I also found really interesting, I wanted to ask you about Obama under his emotional style. Both of them, Trump is very, very upbeat at 88. Obama is at 76. Trump then, of course, meets his stereotype at angry with 48. But former President Obama is at 43, and then Obama weighs in depressed at 48 is his second one, whereas President Trump is only down at 27. Why? So what's going on? What's going on with this graph? Why is your graph showing that the former President Obama is depressed?
Okay, just a second here. Don't take this very seriously at all. Remember that you're looking at tweets, for crying out loud. Tweets. What the hell's going on in our culture that tweets are a form of conversation?
That's a great question. You're the professor. I'm asking you.
Yeah. Tweets are a sign of how people are thinking. But the reality is one should, if I were going to do any kind of research on a personality, yes, if tweets were available, by God, I'm there. I'm going to analyze it. However, please understand that tweets, you are playing to the audience. A tweet is not a conversation. A tweet is not self-reflection. I'm much more interested in, once these people are alone in their rooms and they're writing, let's say, they're writing something for themselves or a personal note to somebody, that gives me a much better sense of who they are. Now, is Obama depressed? No. A 46 is not depressed. Give me an 80, and if it's been going on for a long time, I would say it's very possible that the person is that there are issues. So again, these go from a scale from 0 to 100. So a 46 probably reflects some kind of, who knows, it could also just be talking about the economy. And if you talk about the economy and use the word depression a lot, that's going to feed in. I have no idea what these numbers reflect.
And going off of, tangenting off of depression and depressed, you studied a lot of poets who ended up committing suicide, and you started talking and studying depression and the amount of I's that people use when they're suffering depression. What's going on there? In your book, you write out that there's a high correlation between the amount that someone uses I and the likelihood that they're actually suffering from depression. Why might that be?
So it's interesting. There's actually one depression that claims that depression is a disease of self-focus. That when a person is depressed, they are looking inward all the time. That they're in such pain that it's drawing their attention to look inward. And you see the same thing if you're physically sick. You go back and look at your emails during periods when you were physically sick or depressed, and you'll see that your use of I words is higher. And this is also a marker. When a person's depressed, they also ruminate a lot and they're ruminating about themselves. They're ruminating about their health, their weight, their diet, their sleep, their this, their that. But when we're depressed, we are looking inward at very high rates, and our language follows that.
Now, you recently started a new project about COVID-19, which is, as you just mentioned, sickness, illness that's sweeping the world. All of a sudden, we have isolation that's sweeping the world. Everywhere across the world, people are now locked up in probably a lot of dysfunctional homes and stuck in dysfunctional relationships in the four walls. You can't get out. You can't go anywhere. And it's having a tremendous impact on the entire globe, economy, everything. But you and your researchers decided to start scrolling through blogs, Twitter, I'm sure Facebook posts, and starting to analyze language. And you've done this before with major global events. But what are you seeing happen right now with COVID-19, and what are some of the things that you guys are projecting of the impact that the lasting impact that this might have on the global psychological health?
Well, it's never trust anybody's projections about the future, including mine.
That's wise advice.
So I can tell you what's happened. So some of our best data is actually from social media, specifically Reddit. I love Reddit. So for those listeners out there, if you don't know what Reddit is, just go to your computer and you'll see that these are essentially modern day bulletin boards where people get in these discussions with one another. And please make lots of comments on your Reddits because I'm there studying them. But what's interesting about them is we've been looking at people in communities in the United States. We have 18 cities that we've been tracking. And we're interested in terms of how much they are using different types of words. And what we're finding is that we're able to see the giant jumps in anxiety, especially at the very beginning. And so none of us knew what was going to happen. We didn't know if we were going to die. We didn't know much of anything. And the economy is crashing at the same time. So some of these effects are probably the economy as well as the fear of COVID. So what we find are these big increases in anxiety, which have now come down not to what they were before COVID, but they're kind of manageable. Another interesting thing that happened, which goes against what you just said, was we found that almost as soon as COVID landed, whereas anxiety went way up, anger and expressions of anger dropped precipitously.
Really?
We find this, yes. And we're finding the same thing with surveys. We've been doing surveys in the United States, but also around the world. So in the first several weeks that we were all sitting together in homes, often in dysfunctional families, anger and hostility dropped, which I found fascinating.
It's very surprising.
Now, that doesn't mean it's going to stay there. And in fact, we've been seeing an increase in it in the last week or two. But what this is pointing to is that what we see in an upheaval is right now is somewhat unpredictable. What we saw so we're now 3 months into it. What we found was this big increase in anxiety, and then it's dropped down. We saw this drop in anger, and then it's starting to come back up. And will it go up much higher? No idea. We're finding, and also the way we're connecting with others is very different. So think about other big events. I don't know where your listeners are from, but in virtually every country over the last 50 years, there have been a few major upheavals in that country. In the United States and elsewhere, 9/11 was a big one, and I did a lot of research on that. But there have been others as well. And one thing that happens almost always when there's a major upheaval is it brings people together. They spend more time with others. They go and talk with people in their homes, in your home, out in a park or whatever. And this is a natural way that we work. 9/11, that there was a tremendous amount of people go to memorial service together. It really did. And if you ask people, they say it brought the culture together. We find this with natural disasters as well. This has been a weird one because you can't go and talk to others. And so you're stuck at home the entire time. And what we're finding is that on Reddit and elsewhere, people report feeling much closer to family. Well, that's good because their family's all around them.
Yeah.
And so there's a big increase in family, and then it's dropping down some. In terms of how close we are to friends, we're not as close as we have been in the past because you're not seeing them. To how close do you feel to your city or community? It's actually pretty low. And in the United States, how close do you feel to your country? It's extremely low. In other words, here we are in this major upheaval, and we're not able to take advantage of our social networks the way that we have in others. And that's what makes this one such an odd one. So we're very close to family, but less so to others. And now one of the interesting questions, because we're moving now into this new stage, and depending on which country you are now, it's as though, okay, everything's fine, although it probably isn't. Or the country is saying, no, you need to stay in longer, which makes your life miserable. So we're all kind of screwed no matter what happens. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, we've asked people this. We said, what do you think in 2 years? How's your life going to be different than it was before COVID? And this has been kind of interesting. In the United States, we're finding people are saying, I don't think I'm going to go to restaurants as much in 2 years as I did in the past. And a lot of them are saying, I've discovered that there's a kind of a sanity to this life that I've been leading. I'm kind of enjoying cooking. Or I'm not going to do exotic traveling anymore. I'll be happy to stay closer to home. So we're finding those two things. So if you're in the travel business, you don't want to hear this. If you're in the restaurant business, you don't want to hear this. If you're in the theater business, etc. And then also, do you think you'll work at home in the future? And overwhelmingly, people say, working from home turns out to be a lot better than I thought.
Wow.
Or, I support online education. I'll continue to do that. In other words, you see some of the shifts that some will stick, some won't. I talked to a group about these findings, and one person says, well, that sounds a little bit like a drunk the next morning swearing that they're never going to have alcohol again. And that might be true here. So we say this, but will we see this in behavior? I have no idea.
That is the question. Is it just the talk of the night? There's an Arabic saying it's the talk of the night amounts to nothing in the morning, meaning that once we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, and I'm gonna, and the morning comes, you're like, nah. So that's the question. But we have to go to a break right now. But stay tuned for the conclusion of this conversation with Dr. James Pennebaker, where we're going to take the next step in the conversation and talk about how we can apply this to our life. How can we apply some of his research to processing our own traumatic experiences that many people are going through right now across the world today. Also, I love to hear your questions. Please WhatsApp me at +1 202 922 0220. WhatsApp me, and I would love to answer your questions. And if you send me a voicemail, I will answer your questions right here on the show. My book, Anchored: The Discipline to Stop Drifting, is out. Please go and get the book. It was written in a time of my life where everything seemed to be falling apart. And I began writing, and I found these principles that I was able to anchor my life in. And I'm consistently going back to this book. I'm consistently going back to these principles on a weekly or a daily basis to help move forward, to break out of this feeling of being stuck, to break out of this feeling of the mundane, and actually reach my goals and live the life that I feel called to live. And I'm sure that you want that too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. That's all for this episode. Roll over to the second part of the conversation with Dr. Pennebaker. Remember, you are a change maker. Go out, pursue truth, and own the future.